Hello, and welcome to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. I'm Ryan Purvis, your host, supported by our producer Heather Bicknell. In this series, you'll hear stories and opinions from experts in the field, stories from the front lines, the problems they face and how they solved them, the areas they focused on from technology, people and processes, to the approaches they took that will help you to get to the grips with the digital workspace inner workings. Simon, welcome to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. Do you want to give us a quick introduction?
Yes, pleasure to be here. I'm Simon Clifford. I was formerly Director of Digital and Data for Police ICT company, now Police Digital Service. Before that, I was Director of Digital Transformation for Northamptonshire Police, the Policing Officer, the Police and Crime Commissioner. So I've been in policing for the last 5 years. I've now left, set up my own company to support digital and public protection called Clip 42.
Lovely. So we started chatting about the Wardley mapping technique, which is the one thing I wanted to sort of learn from you and how you applied it. And then you can maybe give us some more stories around being in the police world.
Well, absolutely. And it's certainly distinct. I was in the private industry prior to working in policing. I've got 20 plus years experience of that. And I'm being modest because I'm an old boy. Ultimately it's a 24/7, 365. It sounds trite to say it, but that does taint everything you do. And equally, you can't say this is our target demographic or our target market. It is cradle to grave. So that colors what you do. And given that it's law enforcement, security is always front of mind because there are people that want to interrupt our core business. So there's lots of peculiarities in policing and public protection. And again, counter to a lot of the listeners, I'm sure, in the private sector, we want less customers, not more. So ultimately, it's how do we do that? And certainly going into that space, I was much like, I'm sure lots of people are listening, blind to a lot of what policing actually is in terms of the prepare and prevent stuff. People don't see that as much, and it's a large amount of what policing is doing. Policing is most effective when crime isn't happening because they prevented it from happening. That's a really good thing. Clearly, we see the cars with blue lights, etc. But there are countless challenges in large governmental organizations. This is police and this is other organizations, and those are cultural, technical, and many other things. And that's the challenge. I went in with a whole bunch of hubris thinking that I'm going to identify problems that they've never even seen because of this, some of the stuff I was doing in the private sector. And actually, policing is full of things that is a problem, but it just struggles with giving a nothing's priority, that classic you can't boil the ocean piece. But absolutely how you can not, how you deduplicate, how you actually make progress when you're talking about an organization of north of 200,000 people with national reach across incredibly complex different business types. The structure's quite complex. We've got regional forces, we've got regional organized crime units, we've got the NCA, and we've got external partners that are in some way or another involved in law enforcement. Every corporate entity, every business of a certain scale has either an anti-fraud department or something looking into sort of criminality, and ultimately how we interact with that, how we support local authorities, etc. So it's a complicated beast, and ultimately, my job to some extent was trying to create some simple narratives to help actually inject some progress into some of these really challenging problems.
What are your thoughts? I mean, just with the recent Euro final and people sort of running into the stadium, I mean, was that something that could have been prevented?
Well, I mean, certainly even outside of the policing, I wouldn't step on the toes of those inside it. It's what I would say is it's always a very delicate balance between over policing and under policing, and equally there are very bizarre, if you're a layperson, kind of things that happen because of police presence. So, if a lot of police turn up outside pubs, in some cases, a fight is more likely to break out than not, because the people are fighting that's full of bravado. They don't really want to fight, and they know the police will stop it, as opposed to if you get into a fight, that guy might kill me. So actually putting the police on the street in some cases might even incite that piece. And again, putting people in full riot gear can be deemed as kind of confrontational by protesters, right? So there's a really delicate piece in terms of the visibility of policing, but it's certainly not my specialty. Ultimately, I can tell you with absolute conviction that all the people I've worked with in policing, operational officers and civilians, they want to keep the streets calm and prevent harm. It was very disappointing what happened at the final in so many ways, but absolutely, even if we had won the game, what was happening on the street was very disappointing.
Yeah, look, and I'm going through that at the moment in South Africa. It's sort of the same sort of thing. We've got a bunch of people looting and stealing, and it's also disappointing because it's just the few ruined for the many, and that's just unacceptable. So let's talk about the Woodley Maps then. So how did you come across this, and how have you used it?
Yeah, so Wardley mapping, I adopted the concept of Wardley mapping a decade ago. There was back in sort of 2009-10, after the sort of economic downturn, I kind of returned to England, having lived abroad for some years, and kind of threw myself into the whole meetup scene and sort of reconnecting, and there's a lot of stuff going on around Shoreditch at the time, etc. And there was one event called Cloud Camp, which was talking about this widespread adoption of cloud back in 2009-10. Yeah. And it was organised in part by Simon Wardley, who invented Woodley mapping, and he never promoted the technique. He just demonstrated it to simplify really complex paradigms. And ultimately, I'd always been at the sort of cutting edge, bleeding edge of organizations trying to sort of get that next competitive advantage, et cetera, et cetera. And I just found it a very simple way of structuring and framing paradigms to non-technical people. I didn't realize quite how revolutionary it was at the time. It was almost matter of fact that you just threw and this is how you describe something. So I didn't realize it wasn't widely accepted and known for a good 4 or 5 years. But I internalized it very, very quickly. It's a little bit like somebody showing you how to play drafts. Once you've seen the rules, you've got the rules. It's not complicated. To be a draft, a competitive drafts player is years and years of practice. And I think that's a good analogy for Wardley mapping. But certainly it really came into its own. It helped me in my career advising businesses in the private sector, but it really came into its own when I went into policing, partly because of the gap between business users, executive management, and IT in terms of the language barrier. My roles were pretty senior, working with non-technical, certainly the technical stakeholders, but they're kind of my tribe. I can talk to that. But actually, it's the non-technical stakeholders really understanding the depth of impact that technologies would have. And COVID's a great example of that. All the technologies used over COVID to do this type of thing. Teams or Cisco or Skype or any of these technologies, they had very narrow use cases pre-COVID, right? And people were procuring things saying, oh, well, we need this for teleconferencing. If we're doing a regional working group, we need to maybe, we might not want to travel, or if there's a sudden emergency meeting we want to do, we've got to have some video conferencing. It's very 90s paradigm. Rather than thinking this is transformational to the way we do business, and also it's an element of resilience. That is a big missed. That was and still is to a large extent a big missed opportunity. Narrowing down through the process of ideation through to procurement, that you narrow down the scope based on the business case. And the business case, when you're actually in the business, is just about saying what value premise do we need to actually drop this into my use case. But typically, a lot of people in an organization don't see the bigger picture. So all they can focus on is their narrow part of the business. From my perspective, perhaps saying, look, we don't want a different video conferencing system for the C-suite that we do for middle management. We don't want a different video conferencing platform for corporate meetings as we do with public. So that language of deduplicating, increasing the scope is much more easily demonstrated in Wardley mapping, but also just personally. There's a whole bunch of doctrines built into the thinking behind Wardley mapping. And again, it's very flexible, and it's not the only thing that I apply in terms of the thinking, but it's just useful to sort of as a skeleton to hang thinking across and as a common language. And common language is part of it, but things like open, biasing towards open, challenging assumptions are literally Wardley mapping 101. But what's also very, very powerful about it is if you actually do a bit of a workshop, and I like shorter workshops, an hour and a half, 2 hours is plenty. All day or multi-day are hard work for everybody. Nobody's kind of willing to go to those. But it's amazing what you can crack through in a Wardley mapping session where you're just saying, look, just tell me top to bottom in plain language what your requirements are, and then you can sort of go off seed and validate some of the technology, et cetera. That's really, really helpful, because actually people placing whether something is sort of bespoke or custom built or off the shelf from their perspective is incredibly, incredibly helpful, because again that lends to actual organizational language. So what's standard? What's standard language in policing is all about the training. It's all around existing policing policies. For within policing, that's completely normal. It's understanding the different forms that you fill in to get a witness statement or to do a charge decision, etc. Those are standardized common pieces of language. That's really useful. So you want to explore those, but it's really helpful in terms of pushing against the bias towards parochialism. And one of the major challenges we have across policing is and by the way, it genuinely comes from the best of intentions. But what do they say about best intentions? Every force wants to do the best they possibly can, but if they all do the best they can in a different way, then you don't have any harmonization. And pretty much any serious case review you see where something's gone seriously wrong, it's because information wasn't flowing. And large time that's not because there's a lack of the key people that are trying to protect individuals involved, the reviewers reviewing. It's just that there was a breakdown in the workflow in terms of the information systems and authorities, et cetera, and that's partly because of the over complexity due to sort of that parochial design. So when you're looking at sort of national scale technologies, it's really helpful to bring people into a room from these different organizations. I mean, it's all policing to you and I and the public, but there's 43 regional forces. There's the National Crime Agency. There's regional organised crime units. These are different things. These are sovereign things that can make their own decisions, and that's just within policing. And then there's clearly a dependency, to the CPS, the court service, et cetera. Yeah. Does that help clarify? Sorry.
Yeah. So I guess, what's the So Wardley Map is, from my understanding, at least, is two axes, where you've got your functionality basically going down one axis, and you cross capturing, I guess, to put that on the other axis to prioritize it. Is that the right understanding?
That's exactly right. So across the bottom, it's basically talking about maturity, and again, this doesn't just talk to technology. It can talk to policy. It can talk to practice, etc. Any of that stuff can be mapped. That's really important, which I'll come back to. But basically, everything comes from a point of genesis. Oh, I've got a bright idea. Wouldn't it be good if we could all work from home, right? A genesis idea. And then you go into custom build. How would we actually build that? And you've done it a couple of times, so now you're using common components. And that moves into such a stage that we're saying, well, actually, we've got something we're going to call Teams or Skype, and it's a product. And you can literally pull it off the shelf, and it'll come with those features. And then it becomes a utility. It's just become so ubiquitous to our lives. To be honest, that sounds like the journey of video conferencing almost pre-COVID, doesn't it? It is just like absolutely hardwired. This is a core tool. We can't be in business without it. That's everything from electricity to phone lines, or all those things. So that's sort of left to right, top to bottom. That is where you focus on proximity to user, and that's again a very important axis. So the key about Woodley Map is positioning has meaning. You can identify things by virtue of that. And top to bottom is the top is broadly the anchor, referred to as the anchor, but ultimately that means, who is this study? From what lens is this map a representation? There's clearly a map of some technology that policing uses that relates to the public might be different from policing. It might be different from police officers as it is police civilian stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So again, there's because ultimately it's about the proximity of the technology. If I talk to a smart speaker, I won't say her name because she'll trigger off. That would be at the top, because if I'm the user and I want to have a query that is search enabled technology, I would need an endpoint device that has a microphone that's interconnected. So the device would be right at the top of the map, and then you connect that. Well, you need voice recognition, that needs to connect to a server, that needs to do a query engine, blah blah blah. We'd be going further and further down the stack, and ultimately, if you wanted to host your own voice-enabled querying device, where would that computer? Would that be an on-prem computer? Would that be a cloud computer? From a product or a custom-built server that's got very special requirements in that, because you need to do a whole bunch of audit, as opposed to something on-prem. And equally, from the left to right piece, there's some really important understanding that the positioning gives you, that actually further to the left, it lends itself to Agile. But Agile isn't the solution to all things. With Agile, there's a lot of inherent costs. You've got, with rapid change, it's quite hard to scale a rapidly changing environment just from a training perspective. If you're changing the build of software every day or every week, if you're the user that's not an expert user, that's challenging. You log in this morning and it's different to what it was when you put it down at night. You kind of want some stability. So in terms of, whilst there's fantastic in terms of rapid design and evolution in Agile space, there are some things you want kind of stable. You don't want a new power plug every week that you need to change all your electronic devices to plug into the wall with. That wouldn't be healthy at all. That would be kind of an Agile piece. So the more to the right, the lower cost and the more scalable something is. More to the left, the more flexible and responsive it is. And again, that's why the positioning has meaning, because it informs the types of people that are, some people tend towards Agile projects, some people tend to sort of Six Sigma projects. Attitude and attitude of the people is really key, and breaking things down to small teams. We know this from sort of Virgin or AWS. These organizations recognize small teams are enormously valuable, but the right people in those teams. If you've got somebody who is completely focused on procurement processes, pace isn't their top of their agenda. Procurement processes are. And on the right-hand side, when you're spending £10 million or more, a large amount of money, private or public, you want to go through those steps, but equally not at the cost of the wider benefit. Penny wise, pound foolish, is what I used to say.
Yeah.
Does that give you a bit of an overview that's clear?
It does. In my head, I'm trying to apply it to a project, and I'm trying to think about what are the questions you ask. Like, how do you start, and then how do you make sure it's almost that, are you doing it right? I always have that nagging feeling, am I doing this the right way?
So I'll give you an example. So early in my journey in policing, I worked in Northamptonshire Police. I was director of digital transformation there, working for the PCC there, who had a real focus on the digital agenda, and was recognizing as an elected police and crime commissioner, cybercrime being one of the areas that he recognized was. It wasn't in the public zeitgeist as much then as it is these days, albeit it's still, I would argue, not enough. So I set up a cyber cluster. The first cyber cluster coming out of police headquarters at the time. This was back in 2017, I think. And what we had is, this is Northamptonshire. Northamptonshire very geographically central to the country. The cost of land is quite cheap. We've got a lot of back office functions. So we had small businesses, SMEs, and also corporate businesses. And we invited sort of people from their security teams to come along, and we'd have people from policing there. So we could have this regular dialogue. It's a regular monthly meeting. And it still goes on to this day, the cluster that I set up. And one of my early conversations was, what's it like working with the police? Do you report all your incidents? And the answer was no, absolutely not. So, well, why not? Well, if you call 999, they don't know how to respond to a cybercrime. They say go to action fraud, and action fraud is imperfect. It's going through a procurement. I want to be sensitive to my colleagues, former colleagues, but it's very lengthy and it's very one size fits all in terms of the response. So whether you're a cyber professional or Joe Schmo public, the steps you're going to go through are exactly the same. And long story short, it takes 45 minutes to report. And long story short, there's an overwhelming amount of traffic going in there. And a lot of it is extra jurisdictional, i.e. it's very challenging for UK law enforcement to do much with because it's coming out of Russia or another state it's outside of our jurisdiction. It becomes inherently more complex. And again, there's a law of diminishing returns going on there. Yeah. So ultimately it was about applying kind of the Wardley mapping techniques. It was about understanding the user, and the user was, look, the reality of public protection or government is money follows demand. In the best case, you have to be able to demonstrate the demand to say I need money to solve this problem. Because what problem? What's the measurable? What's the metric that I'm actually wanting to spend money on? So clearly, there's a real negative consequence to people not recording cybercrime. But equally, you can see why they don't, because they're being attacked on a daily basis, and they'd rather spend that hour limiting the damage or stopping it happening again than something that they do to help police out and not get anything in return. So that was a problem that I expanded upon, and I used Woodley mapping in terms of understanding what we needed to do. Yeah. Ultimately, what we need to do is have a really lean approach to getting incidents reported. And off the back of that, using mapping, I broke down what was the requirement, what was the benefit to policing. Look, fundamentally, from our side, if you do report that crime and it does get picked up, it will go to action fraud and then referred back out. We put investigators on it, and that's old school policing. In terms of they would come to your office and they would look at the computer, they'd try and download some log files, and then they'd try and do all that forensic stuff. And that was an incredibly expensive process, especially given the volume. It doesn't scale to cybercrime. And to be honest, 9 out of 10 times it's going to come from extra jurisdiction, which means it kind of stops there. We can send an email to Russia, they're not going to reply. Right? So at that point, it's pretty hard. And again, law of diminishing returns. We don't have infinite resources. So what we created was saying, look, ultimately the user we need the metrics to say, what's the volume of actual cyber attacks, and B, what is that extra jurisdictional piece? There's a lot of other countries that aren't UK. So, we want to inform our partners in wider government to say, look, if you're going to go see Putin, if you're going to go, to India, if you're going to go to, North Korea, or whatever, be armed with this data and saying, look, this level of threat is coming from you. So Wardley mapping was an approach by which we could break down what the requirements could be. It allowed us to importantly pick a lot of technology that was basically off-the-shelf technology. And again, there's tend towards off-the-shelf. Use open standards. So, and again, I'm sure a lot of your listeners, this is very native stuff. It's just like, what's your technology? In tech terms, it's what's your technology stack, and ultimately it's a stack. It connects together seamlessly. What are the requirements that it needs to do? But ultimately, when you're creating something that hasn't existed before, there's some particular user requirements around that in terms of making what's the benefits of policing? Well, we want to capture it better. We want to focus our attention on the stuff that adds the most value, and then ultimately get a prosecution. So it needs to be submittable in court. Well, log files are not a particularly forensic thing. They're just text files on a server. you do get vexatious complaints to police. It's a minority, but we also always have to be have a critical eye to any report of crime. Not every rape report is true. Undoubtedly, most are, but some are vexatious. I'm angry with this former lover. I'm going to say they raped me, because people do these terrible things. Yeah. But likewise, you can apply it. So you need really good evidential kind of scrutiny. So we created this system. It's basically largely based on corporate scene products, which small businesses can't afford, but put a layer on top. And when you map that, it basically says, this is our existing process. This is the stuff that you can't get off the shelf. The stuff that makes it evidentially submittable, that geolocates attack, et cetera, and ultimately creates a quid pro quo. Because then again, working with the user, another core premise within the Wardley mapping doctrine of good practices, is understanding their need. And ultimately, one of the bigger needs was, whilst I was having very senior stakeholders come to this meeting, techies are often the unloved one, right? We power the businesses, but technology is often not loved, and the security subset within that technology grouping is loved the least, right? Yeah. So when if you're a CISO and you're asking for more money, your native language doesn't work well with your board, right? Yeah. So actually, we picked up that as a requirement from their side of the fence, right? So long story short, we were able to frame the user needs from the client side, i.e. the member of the public that we'd like to report criminal incidents, make an approach that was very, very simple to use. And the net result of that is something that's called police cyber alarm. Anybody in the UK can use this technology. It can be applied for you by police. It's paid for by police. It's free of charge. And ultimately, it just allows you to share log file data in real time. You download a piece of software, you sign up to the program, you know what it's collecting. There's no personal data about it. But ultimately, it will analyze those log files in real time for attack vectors. Yeah. And ultimately, we can capture that information, and that is really helpful to us in terms of, if there's some serious criminality, investigating that criminality, taking it to court, and importantly, getting a lot of that scale of demand. And that's really, really helpful when you get these emerging new types of crime coming out, because it's about satiating the demand. How can we quickly identify that there's a new serious demand, again, which could never have been done at the required pace of cyber, and actually being able to deploy a fix. We can do this by creating this kind of sense network. Now, that couldn't have been achieved within a reasonable timescale or timeline. And again, there were other projects that I became aware of after I'd kind of built this thing that had been going in the rounds that were just saying, is there a way we could get technology to identify international threat actors on its own? And some significant money was seeded and invested in different places to that, and failed because the approach was wrong. The cyber alarm pilot, the technology that is largely, it's mostly tweaked today, but it's largely what I built sort of 5 years ago. Took best part of 3-4 months, and that's including the whole internal process to get sign off. So we got internal sign off and built a solution in sub 6 months that's now rolled out technology that was only going to go from strength to strength. And that was because we didn't duplicate effort. We didn't build anything that wasn't already out there. We reused as possible, and again, this was 2017. And I thought, come on, think big, start small, scale fast. I didn't coin that phrase, and it certainly wasn't fresh in 2017. But going out the gate, saying, look, this may fail, and if it fails, let's not have wasted too much money. But if it succeeds, we don't just need a cyber response in Northamptonshire. We've got to think national. So from the outset, we said, well, how does this model in? And again, that's where actually the wider structure and existing backbone of police technology programs work well, because I piloted Northamptonshire with sovereign funding from Northamptonshire, and then to extend the pilot to the East Midlands region, which ran for another year, I just connected into a national program that was already looking to invest in this stuff. And they knew all the problems, but had no idea in terms of dealing with the solutions. I mean, no idea. They were still struggling with some of the solutions. You go here is pre-made solution. We've already tested it in one county in this region. How about we expand it out? We did. It was successful, and now that's a national rollout. And arguably that could go out multinationally. The principle is, there's no point in deploying technology if it's unaffordable. The principle is, it's really more about the thematic approach you're trying to do. In business, it's about being more competitive. That's your overarching piece, or delivering new services that people like, but not trying to create something that's so far beyond the realms of possibility that will put you out of business, putting all your own, all your profit into there forever. So you've got to sort of put a dose of pragmatism. But equally, I would argue that where this is incredibly useful in sort of national program paradigms is that a lot of misinformed, outdated thinking going into large scale procurement says we have to have one solution that does all of these things. And from a small business outlook perspective, you go, well, yeah, that's clearly not affordable. ERP is a good example. Well, you look at an enterprise ERP, it's £1 million. It's a year project. Well, what does it actually do? I need invoicing, I need payroll. I can get all of those things for little amounts of money. How about I just bolt all those cheap things together and it gives me an ERP for a tenth or a hundredth the cost? From me as a businessman, wouldn't that be sensible? And that's where public sector needs to sort of wake up to it. But it's one of those things that it's just not helpful to tell people you're right, I'm right, you're wrong. They have to come with you on the journey. And that really lends itself to the stakeholder piece, which is why mapping is so helpful, both from the user perspective, but also at the corporate, because there's a real distance between sort of C-level and the middle tier. So you might have great vision at the top, but it's implemented poorly because lost in translation somewhere down the line. You can bring people around the table to much more effectively with techniques like this. And I wouldn't say a Woodley Map is perfect for everybody, but for people that go through the process, it's helpful, and that allows you to synthesize much higher quality insights. And most importantly, get effective results. I applied this technique to every project I was involved with, and I had a pretty good reputation in terms of actually delivering programs, consistently delivering programs on time, typically under budget, because the technique of just deduplicating. I was always going on about, I want to know, I was a real fan of Not Invented Here. If somebody else has fixed this problem and it's meets all my needs and it's affordable and it's scalable, exactly, I'll just use yours. Why would I want to try and reinvent that? Yet that still happens far too much.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking some banking examples where I remember sitting in a meeting and you find out that you've got 25 tools that do the same thing, and someone wants to bring in a 26th one because they've been enamored by one piece of functionality that it brings, instead of cutting back the 25 down to 3 or 2 or whatever the thing is. Because
banking is a great example because it's such a highly profitable sector. You can hide in the private sector. You can hide a lot of technical failure in just the massive things you've got, right? And certainly, how do you measure what's the right amount of money to spend on something? And certainly that's something I've looked at within policing. So we spend about £1.5 billion a year on technology. That's everything. Well, it's kind of everything. It's an agreed number. As of a couple of years ago, people, hardware, software, the whole thing. But that's on a 12.5 odd billion kind of spend. So that's about 11.4%. Which, if you compare that to private sector, banking, securities are typically the upper end of that, at about 6 or 7% of their turnover is that space. But things like construction's in the 1.5%, because mostly it's materials and people, right? But if you take that 1.5 billion, saying, well, actually, we're 12. Do the maths. It's best part of a delta of maybe £500 million, and that's compared to banking and security. And I tell you, we hemorrhage people all day long to banking. All bank fraud departments are like a former police officer, right? And And we give them really high quality training. They are motivated to do good, and they'll get a 20 grand bump pretty much out the gate, whatever role, going across to corporate. So banking is paying more for its people, but it's still paying a large degree less, and that's partly because of duplication, outdated techniques, and again, it's not that we have bad people. It's not that we have bad thinking. It's about the frame of reference. It's what you can see. It's blinkered visibility, and largely that's about security. That's about culture. Security. The first three questions you need to talk about when you're talking about technology and policing. But equally, in terms of there was a kind of a recognized thing that if you wanted to do things quickly, do them on your own. You want to do them the right way, you do them together, but slowly. And ultimately, lack of pace is a death knell to programs, because it just creates this expectation that's down tomorrow. So many programs are like, this is going to be amazing. This is going to make this all better. It's all going to be shiny and amazing. It'll be here in 2 years' time. Yeah, and you pretty much know that you've already switched off most of the audience, because particularly, and again in policing, there's you get this in the corporate world in terms of people staying within roles, but culturally, certainly for warranted officers, if you're going up the ranks, certainly above certain ranks, there's an expectation that you understand the whole business. There's a lot of departments in policing. For serious organised crime to neighbourhood policing, to domestic abuse. So those are different units. So if you're going up the ranks, inspector and above, you're expected to have a good understanding of all the different areas of policing, from the control rooms and firearms policing, etc. So what happens is you'll have a tenure of maybe 2 years per job. So if you're 12 months into a role, you're only going to be there another 12 months, and then you'll be cycled out. If you are sitting now on a board that's going to deliver in 2 years' time, you show up and you will read the papers and you'll give them your 2 pence worth. But it's not going to impact any of the output that you're going to be responsible. You're paying it forward, right? And that's fine. But equally, something that says, look, by the way, you have this massive challenge. Do you want to do well? And I'm going to drop something that's going to start actually giving you positive impact within 3 months. The attitude completely changes, right? And I'd rather give something less, but quickly, than promise on the earth and it be 2 years away, because that 2 years will invariably slip to 3 and 4 and beyond. And there's countless examples of that across government and private sector. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly it. Whenever it's far away, it's easier to expand it. It's like I can pierce the law or something. If you say it's going to take 2 years, take 2 years. And I mean, it's something that I appreciate about the agile approach, where you're releasing something every week, and you're experimenting with it, as opposed to some sort of big bang approach.
But it doesn't scale to 120,000 officers, right? You don't want to be releasing, people that literally have a very full day every single day they turn up for a thing, and what they're doing is incredibly important. Not knowing how to do something so that it's done wrong, that means that you can't actually get a prosecution if somebody's done something very bad, that's unacceptable. So it's about going through but just concatenating the timescales, concatenating the expectation of fixing everything, and working to the thematic. How do we make and AI and automation are really good examples of that. And certainly another element of the Wardley Map piece is something that I've been really focused on over the last couple of years in policing, and also with my new company, is about layering different strata within it. So if you take the example of cyber alarm or public contact or various other things, it's about saying, here's our process design, here's our technology that maps it. That's very conventional. And there's a great report for people who want to know more. If you look on do search on Google or any other search thing for GCHQ boiling frogs. And again, that talks about how GCHQ is using this technology to unpick really complex technologies years ago. And again, it was applying this technology. And again, AWS uses this approach as well. But ultimately, breaking things down to small steps, but also understanding, when we talk about the cyber piece, when we talk about cyber, we talk about a whole bunch of crimes, modern slavery. There's different jurisdictions in terms of legality. There's ethical postures to consider, right? So that can be mapped to, what is the maturity of the ethics around using automation, AI, in identifying fingerprints.
Yeah.
It's quite a mature set. Using gait analysis or facial recognition, A, the technology is less mature. B, the ethics is definitely not as mature as it should be. It's more mature than it was 2-3 years ago, given some positions that have come out of the Information Commission's office. But again, you can map that in terms of its maturity evolution. It'll only get more understood, not less.
Yeah.
And that's helpful. When everybody accepted it's ethically okay to use technology in this context here, and from my perspective, once you identify that this is something that you kind of need to get to a good communicated stance, from my perspective, using AI to identify weapons on CCTVs is a really good use of AI. Ultimately, there's 100,000 cameras across London. How do you identify somebody's walking out of a chill, getting out of a car with an AK-47? You don't have eyes on 100,000 cameras simultaneously. AI can pick that up and say, hey, Mr. Operator, maybe you want to look at this. I think I've identified a gun in the street.
Yeah.
I don't think many of the public would have a problem in us using artificial intelligence for that. I do think people would have a problem in terms of sort of a Chinese-esque kind of monitoring of our whereabouts 24/7. And those are poles apart. The technology is in common, but the application is different. That's an ethical piece. And from my perspective, just get over the line. Do the ethical consideration, make a call, make that, broadcast it, publish it. Every police officer can go into that. And that links to some of the work I was doing around standards that talk to technology and data standards. And again, making a much more open environment, for partners and technology providers to serve us better in terms of what is our connectivity standards, but equally what are our ethical standards and wider postures. Because actually, we want the private sector to have built better solutions for us. So they're ready to go. We want to pick off the shelf wherever possible. We have this money to spend. We've got the budget, but let's just spend it better for better public protection, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up facial recognition because I remember reading something about, is it called Clearview? Well, there was a company in the States that was they were processing all the faces of Facebook or something. And the US various legal arms actually were not allowed to use it because of the ethical issues, which I tend to agree with, to be quite honest.
And again, this is where you need to unpick it. And again, this is not about me. I'm not a professional ethicist, but you can place where ethics should be in the process. You want to tick a box that says proper ethics is being looked at. And again, like the technology, like saying we want body-worn video. The business case for that going through to policing, and it's pretty much ubiquitous in UK policing now. Body-worn video use case was fundamentally about what we call internally professional standards, i.e. Defending police officers from vexatious complaints. Somebody gets arrested, they don't like being arrested, so they're going to say the police officer hit me and treated me badly. So if you've got video, you can say, this is from when he started talking to you to him, putting you in the van, nothing happened. Those complaints dried up overnight. But equally, if somebody did, that same video is going to be used to discipline that or remove that officer. Right? We don't want officers that act inappropriately like that. So that's a really good thing. However, it evolved into much greater things. People were self-improving. We've got this government policy, 20,000 new cops. That means we've got a lot more newish cops, and experienced officers will tell you there's only so much you get from the training. A lot of what is being a police officer is experience of doing. And in many cases, police officers, because they want to be good and effective and better, we've got a really good quality of police officer in the UK. Is they're using this material to review what their interaction was with somebody that they've arrested, so they can answer that. So they can think, because again, when and I hear of this, I've never done it, but when the adrenaline's up, you forget what you said. But you've actually now got a perfect representation of he said this, I said that, he said this, I said that. I could have done that better, and it's self-training. That was nowhere to be seen in the business case, but it's actually improving quality.
Yeah, out of interest, do the police in the UK wear body cameras like the US do?
Oh no, yeah, absolutely, very widespread. Yeah, body-worn video, but again, that talks to the wider AI piece. How long we retain it? We have something called MOPI, Management of Police Information, I think it is, and videos within that, and again, depending on whether it's used for prosecution. If it's not, then the general practice is it's deleted within 30 days, because you retain it for 30 days in case a complaint comes in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But then you delete it because it's not used evidentially.
But I can imagine that you had that all stored in a cloud environment where it's being processed by algorithms looking for things that the cops might have missed at the time.
See, exactly. I love the way you're thinking. That's exactly the way my mind thinks. But absolutely, that is an incredibly contentious point by certain civil rights people. And appropriately, we need to have considered the negative consequences of that. But consider them, make a position, policing, one of the, a former colleague who was an ex-chief superintendent taught me so much about policing. I'm forever in his debt for that. And one of the things is just this understanding that, a police officer can take a life to save a life. He can make a judgment to kill somebody to protect that person from killing somebody. Yeah. And they have to, it's a lawful thing to do as long as they can basically explain why that was the case. So ultimately, we imbue an awful amount of authority in our warranted officers. The Queen's warrant to deprive somebody else of their liberty, that's a serious thing. But equally, the technology, we can't just assume that we can look at it for all other kinds of things. So there's always a proportionality piece that comes into this, and this needs to evolve. And that, again, lends itself to the evolution of practice. Because, again, I use the example of identifying guns, but if you understand AI, it's just pattern analysis. It's just saying, I'm looking for an object. The AI doesn't know it's a gun. You just trained it saying these types of things that happen to be guns. Look for those. Well, the same technology could be used to use your face or your haircut or your shirt or your logo, right? Or your license plate. So to blanket saying police shouldn't use AI is to say, well, even for identifying guns in the street from a marauding terrorist attack like Paris, wouldn't it be good to be able to shut that down pretty quickly? Oh, yeah. Well, in that case, well, okay, is it blanket or not? Now you've given one reason why it's appropriate, but equally you kind of need to unpick that.
Yeah, and that's one of the sort of criticisms of the Amazon devices is that they have to listen to you in order to trigger, which means they are, in theory, hearing what you're saying, even if they're not recording it. They could be recording it. Yeah, I think if you ever read Kevin Kelly's stuff, what was it called, the 12 eventualities or something. One of those things is your data is going to go in the cloud, and it's going to be used. It's up to you to decide how much of that is you want to be there or not. And I think that's I'm no super specialist on Amazon. I don't want to pick them out particularly, but just smart speakers. Yeah. It has to be listening for the trigger word, and that is, I understand, kept locally because it's only an activation word, right? That's certainly the line that they've been putting out, and likewise increasingly on phone devices as well. That auto translate with Google and all these types of things. That's done on the device. Yeah. Whether you trust or not that they're secretly taking that's a lot of data if you're taking raw WAV files, right? Or even MP3, right? Well, exactly. I mean, I'm trying to explain it to my parents.
What's the business case for storing all of that chatter, quite frankly? Yeah. I mean, even if you justify it. But again, it's a lack of understanding. People just emotively jump to conclusions. If you say, look, this is our policy, policing is explainable. We do this because we've made this decision. We think this is a proportion. There's checks and balances.
No, and that's it. I mean, I've tried to explain that to my in-laws and my parents that these devices are doing these things a certain way. They wouldn't be generally accepted in the industry if they were not doing that. And of course, we had that stage where they were taking the recordings to a centralized place where contractors were actually reviewing the data. But as I say, there's almost there's a convenience risk that you swap out to say, well, I'm happy for them to hear my recordings as long as the tool gets better. And I'm not talking about, personally, I'm not talking about things that I'm too worried about it recording.
And one thing is that, look, what I would say is government and its use of technology isn't in a vacuum. Okay, and this is one of the really major things that people miss. And I jumped on the sort of marauding terrorist tag using identifying guns and stuff. But equally, cybercrime, malware, romance fraud, all these types of things. Software on your device that's waiting for you to sell your house. It can sit there for multiple years waiting for that transaction so it can see and take your money, right? Yeah. And you're wiped out. Do you want us to protect you against that? Because ultimately the attack vector is enabled because you're using this technology, laptops and phones and stuff. Do you want police to protect you in that part of your life, or just say, it's technology, policing aren't there? Because that is where criminality is moving to, has moved to, and it's a multi-billion pound dollar business. And if we just say it's off limits, we're basically saying everything digital is the wild, wild west, good luck. And I don't want to live in that world.
And I saw an article the other day saying that there's actually VC funders for ransomware teams. So, that's become an industry on its own. And further to that, I actually was reading something that people that were taking out insurance for, your cyber insurance really, for being hacked or being hit with ransomware, the premiums are going up by 300-400%. Because it's just happening so often, and
also what it covers. I mean, maybe it'll recover your technology. Will it recover your restoration data? It certainly won't recover the loss of value of your organization if it's publicly listed, right? So again, there's that's one of those areas that there is so much ground to cover, and we're not aiming at a target that's standing still. The threat vector is evolving super rapidly. But look, I'm conscious of time, but I don't want to leave this on a dull note. The reality is we have enormous resources. £1.5 billion is a lot of money, and that's just in the UK. And we work very closely with Five Eyes partners and wider partners, Europe, Europol, Interpol, et cetera, et cetera. We just need to get better at exercising spending that money well and sharing good practice. And certainly that's what I'm focused on in the private sector, because ultimately government is recognizing the public sector as a partner in this. And certainly I'm trying to help catalyze how that works together. I did a project earlier this year with Cabinet Office. And again, just to reassure people that, look, this is across 80,000 users around, across multi-agency. So it's a real example of technology that's being used for environmental resilience. So, big snowstorm, or if we have some other issues, there's a platform that's a geospatial platform on our Cabinet Office. I helped work with some technology providers, very large global technology providers. I prefer not to use their name. Everybody knows who they are, knows this organization. But sharing geospatial data around traffic incidents so that crowdsourced data can actually be used to allow us to identify accidents quicker and getting to people, responding to people with ambulances and emergency services through that technology. But the important point of that, other than its inherent value, is the approach that we took was wherever possible reusing technology, and we had goodwill from the private sector organisation to provide that data for free, and we entirely reused existing technology. So the net cost of that project, rolling out to every police force, fire service, ambulance service in the country, was a net incremental total of zero. We did it in sub 2 months. We enhanced the capability across the piece. Bad news travels fast. Good news almost doesn't get noticed. There are examples where we're using this technology in incredibly powerful ways, and that is the tip of the iceberg of where we can take this down.
Fantastic. I think it's a great place to leave it. If someone wanted to get in contact with you, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, they can just come to the website, cliff42, that's the number 42.com, or just email me, simon@cliff42.com.
So where does the 42 come from?
So it's about avoiding going off cliff edge through situational awareness, and actually it's about asking better questions. And that goes to, well, the ultimate question of life, the universe, everything is what the answer is 42. It's not the answer. It's about asking the right questions.
Well, super. Well, thank you very much for giving us your time today, and it's been great listening to you.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Heather Bicknell is our producer and editor. Thank you, Heather, for your hard work on this episode. Please subscribe to the series and rate us on iTunes or the Google Play Store. Follow us on Twitter @the DWW Podcast. The show notes and transcripts will be available on the website www.digitalworkspace.works. Please also visit our website www.digitalworkspace.works and subscribe to our newsletter. And lastly, if you found this episode useful, please share with your friends or colleagues.